The authentication functionality of our authentication server is complete. Yay! Except there's one issue, and that is we store users and refresh tokens in memory. So we have, for example, this in-memory user repository, and we just store users after they register in this list, and we use this list to get users whenever they do things like log in. We don't actually store these users in something persistent, such as a database. So that's what we're going to do. Let's set up a database for our authentication server, and to do that, we are going to use the entity framework. So let's go into our NuGet packages, and let's manage those. And it's actually on this front page, Microsoft Entity Framework Core, and this is version 5.0.0. I don't know if that's specifically for .NET 5, which I don't actually have installed yet, but it doesn't exactly say it is, so I'm going to go ahead and install version 5.0.0. So the installation did work. Hopefully it works when we do the database interaction. And now we also have to consider our database providers. So that could be SQL Server, SQLite, and I think I'm going to roll with SQLite. Just in case some of you don't have SQL Server installed, you can still follow along. So we're going to have to install Microsoft Entity Framework Core.SQLite. Let's add that. Version 5.0.0 again. And there we go. We should have all the packages that we need. So the first thing we're going to need is a DB context to manage our refresh tokens and users that we're going to store in the database. So we're just going to put that in the models folder. I'll call this the authentication DB context. And we need to inherit from DB context. And we need to add DB sets that are going to map to our database's tables. So we're going to have a DB set for our users, because our database is going to have a users table. So we'll create a property for that, and then we're also going to have our refresh tokens as well. So let's add a DB set for that. And we'll be able to use these DB sets to interact with our database in just a little bit. But for now, let's head over to our startup.cs and register our DB context with dependency injection. So we are going to add a DB context, and the type of our DB context is the authentication DB context. Now we need to configure this DB context, and we can do that with the DB context options builder action right here. So let's get the builder and configure that, and all we're going to do is use SQLite, and let's import that statement. And this is going to take our connection string. So let's get one of those, and I'm going to store that in my appsettings.json. So we can add a section here for connection strings, and we'll call this connection string SQLite, and let's add that connection string. And SQLite connection strings are very simple. All we need is the data source, which will just be the path to the database file, and that'll be a relative path for us, which means we can just put in our database file name. We'll call this authentication.db. So now we can use that connection string in our startup.cs. So let's snag that. And to get that, all we can do is use our configuration, get connection string. So if we look at this method, it'll look at the connection strings section that we created in our appsettings.json. And we named our connection string SQLite. So let's pass that connection string into the use SQLite configuration, and we should be good to go to connect to our database. Now before we can connect to the database, we're going to have to create the database. So if we come into the package manager console, the first thing we're going to have to do is add a migration. And a migration is basically just going to describe our database schema so that when we go to create the database schema in the migration is going to be applied, and we'll have the tables in the database that we need. So let's add a migration here. I believe it's add migration, and we'll call this initial. So this is our first migration. And if you get this error, it's because we don't have the Entity Framework Core tools installed. So let's install package, and we need Microsoft.EntityFrameworkCore.Tools. There we go. And now let's add that migration. So there we go, it's working. And now we get another error. So it says no database provider has been configured. But what? I said use SQLite. What are you talking about? Well, if we read a little bit further, we used add DB context, and if we want to use that, then our DB context needs to accept a DB context options in the constructor and pass it to the base constructor. And that seems to be our issue. So let's go to our authentication DB context, and we need a constructor that accepts DB context options for our authentication DB context. Call that options, and we need to pass that to the base constructor. So we can just pass in those options, and look at that, that constructor is available. And now we got our constructor. Let's try this again. There we go, we got our migration, and look at this. It's going to create a table for our refresh tokens and our users That's perfect. So we could apply these migrations and create our database doing update database here, but I actually don't want to do that. I want my migrations to be applied when I start the application. So we actually have to do that in the program.cs. So when we start up, we're going to have to grab our authentication DB context and run migrations using that DB context against our database, which will also create the database if it doesn't exist. So this build method for our host builder gives us back an iHost. So let's get that iHost, and we're going to have to split all this up, so we're going to have to do a host.run after we build the host. And now that we have the host here, we can use that to get our services and get a service that we registered in our configure services in our startup.cs. So the service we want to get is our authentication DB context. So there's a get service, but we're going to use get required service, which is an extension method, part of Microsoft.extensions.dependency injection. So let's use that. And the type of service we want is our authentication DB context. And let's put that in the variable. And in fact, let's put it in a using statement because we want to dispose of this when we're all done with it. And now that we have our context, all we have to do is call context.database and then migrate. And it doesn't pick up the migrate method with our IntelliSense, but that is because we have to import Microsoft.any framework core. So let's do that. And now it will apply our migrations on startup, which means we never have to worry about manually applying them ever again. So let's go ahead and start this up. So we get our connection string, that works. And we get an invalid operation exception when we try to get our authentication DB context from the service provider. And that is because this DB context is registered as scoped, which is a good thing. That means all requests to our server are going to get their own DB context. But that also means we can't use this method to get our authentication DB context. So if we want to get this scoped service, we're obviously going to need a scope. So instead, what we have to do is use our service provider to create a scope first, and then we'll use the service scope to get our service. So we're going to put that service scope in a using statement because we're going to have to dispose it when we're done. We'll call it scope, and again use our host.services to create the scope. And we'll move this using statement inside of our scope using statement. And now instead of using our host, we can use our scope and grab the service provider on that scope and use that service provider to get our authentication DB context and then do the migration. So if we try that again, the application does start. And if we take a look at our file explorer, there is the authentication database. So let's start interacting with that database to store persistent data. So the first thing we want to do is store our users, and luckily we have this iUser repository interface. So all we have to do is implement this interface using our DB context that's going to connect to our database. So let's add a class inside this user repositories folder, and I'm going to call this database user repository, and we'll implement that interface, and we're going to get a DB context injected in here. So the authentication DB context, we'll just call it context, generate a constructor for that, so it'll get injected, and now we can simply use it. And of course, using an ORM like Entity Framework makes these methods very easy to implement. So for creating a user, we can just take our context, interact with our user's DB set, and add a new user. And then all we have to do is save those changes, and we'll save changes async and await that. So this is going to have to be an async method. And then we will finally return the user, and that's literally all we have to do. And our user does have an ID on it, and I'm not sure if this is going to get auto-generated when we add it to the DB context and save the changes. So we'll have to see how Entity Framework does that by default. So we might have to add that ID manually, but we'll try it without the ID first. So the rest of these methods, just going to be simple queries. Let's go ahead and make all of these async first. And then get by email, all we're going to do is use our context. We're going to be querying the users, and we're going to snag the first user. So let's pass a predicate in here. So the first user that has the email that we're searching for. And if we can't find that email, we're just going to return null. And this action needs to be first or default async. And we're going to have to import Microsoft.any framework core to get that method. And there we go. And we're just going to do the same things for all of these other methods, except get by username. Obviously, you're going to switch all these to username and update this variable to match our parameter. And then for get by ID, since the ID is the primary key, we can actually do find async and just pass in the user ID. So find async just finds an entity with the primary key, which is going to be the user ID. And that's all we have to do for the database user repository. So let's go into our startup.cs, and instead of our iUser repository being an in-memory user repository, we're going to use the database user repository. And before we test this, let's just go ahead and implement the database refresh token repository too. Shouldn't be too difficult. Let's add a class here for the database refresh token repository. Implement our interface, get our DB context in here. So the authentication DB context, call it context again. Inject that by generating a constructor, and let's make all these methods async right off the bat. So for creating, take the refresh tokens on our DB context and add our new refresh token. I think we have the same thing with the ID, so we are going to have to see if that gets generated. And then we'll save those changes async. So deletes are a little bit annoying with Entity Framework, so let's skip those for now. We'll come back in just a second. Let's do the get by token. So we're going to use our context again, the refresh tokens, and we'll do a first or default async, import that, and find the first refresh token where the token matches the token that we're searching for. And now for the deletes. So the easiest way to do this is just query the refresh token first. So we'll put that in the variable, and we'll use our context, refresh tokens, and find. We can do find async because the ID is the primary key for our refresh tokens. So we can find by ID. So if the refresh token is not null, so it actually exists in our database, then we can use our context, take our refresh tokens, and remove the refresh token, which will delete it when we go to save changes async. And there we go. So kind of annoying having to do two operations by querying it first and then removing it. But this is a pretty simple implementation, so I definitely like it. And now moving on to delete all. So this time we're going to have to query multiple refresh tokens, so we'll put those into an IEnumerable, and we'll use our context, grab the refresh tokens, and we want all the refresh tokens, so we'll do a where to filter those out, and we want refresh tokens where the user ID of the token matches the user ID that we're searching for, and we'll call toList async to execute that query. And once we query all those refresh tokens, we're just going to simply take our context, use our DB set for the refresh tokens, and remove a range, and we can pass in all of those refresh tokens. And when we go to save changes, using context save changes async, it'll delete all of the refresh tokens for the user from the database. And now that is it for the database refresh token repository. Let's use that now in our startup.cs, and let's test this out. And we made a small mistake here, so if we go into our startup.cs, we have our repositories registered as singletons. Those need to be registered as scoped because our DB context is registered as scoped. So let's update that. And in fact, this is going to cause kind of like a chain reaction. So if we go into our authenticator, this uses those repositories as well. So that means that's going to have to be scoped too. But I think that should be everything that needs to be changed. There we go. So we're up and running. Let's head over to Postman. So I'll send this register request, hit the breakpoint, look at the user. Okay, so the ID does get generated. That's great. So the registration was okay. Let's go ahead and log in. There we go. The login's good. We get our refresh tokens. Let's actually do a refresh real quick. So send that refresh token. And there we go. We get new tokens. That's great. And last but not least, let's do a log out. So updated the access token and now log out. There we go. We get a success status code. So everything with our database interaction seems to be working. So let's go ahead and restart our server. And now I should be able to log in without having to register first because the user that we initially registered with should be saved in the database already. So let's log in, and boom, there we go. So our user was saved the last time we registered, obviously. And let me grab this refresh token, do a restart on the authentication server, and now let's refresh. And there we go, we get new tokens, so our refresh tokens are successfully being stored as well, and our database is working. So we have successfully added persistence to our authentication server, and I really feel like this could be used in a production environment other than maybe using SQL Server instead of SQLite. But other than that, we have an authentication server, we have persistent storage, users can register, log in, refresh access tokens, and log out to invalidate refresh tokens. So hopefully you all are learning from this series and can apply these concepts to your own applications. If you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave them below in the comment section. But other than that, leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.